now that your rings are lined up, it's now time to solder. This is the setup that you should have at your soldering stations. You've got a torch starter, you have a jar of boric acid, you have flux, you have solder, which is in these little cups so you don't spill it, and you have some water, you have tweezers, and a jeweler's pick. Now, when you solder, what you're doing is you're putting a piece of metal in between the seam, and you are melting that metal so that it combines to these two pieces, two sides, making it one. And if done correctly, you won't be able to see the seam. So the first thing that you're going to do, you're going to make sure that everything is correct in front of you. And you're going to take your boric acid, and you're going to take the lid off. And when you take the lid off, it's denatured alcohol and boric acid. You're going to swish your ring in the boric acid so that parts of that material, that boric acid is on your ring. You're going to take it off, and you're going to put it on the charcoal block. You're going to take and recover that boric acid. Make sure that you stay safe and cover your boric acid. You're going to then take your torch starter, and you're going to light your torch, and you're going to burn off that boric acid. And as you saw, it's now a misty white. It's a misty white. The boric acid is a shield. It's a heat shield so that when you're heating up the metal, when you're soldering, it doesn't create fire scale or shadowing on your ring. Sometimes if you heat it up too much, there's shadowing in the sterling silver. Because it's made out of silver and copper, when you heat it up, sometimes the copper can be revealed in darker shadows or darker grays, and it will shadow. So this boric acid is the protective barrier for that. After you have your soldering, your boric acid burned off, you're going to come in and you're going to grab 1 to 2 pieces of solder, depending on your solder seam. If it's a big solder seam, you're going to get 2. If you get a small piece of solder, you're going to get 2 pieces of solder. So I just put the solder right there. So I'm going to take my seam with my tweezers now. I'm going to carefully put it over that. Now, this is one of 2 ways that I'm going to show you how to solder. After the solder is underneath, you're going to take the flux and the paintbrush, and you are going to paint the inside and the outside of your ring, just on the seam. You'll put it back, and now it's time to solder. Now when you solder, you're going to use the tip of the bright blue, and that is the hottest part, and you're going to run it up and down the seam. Now the solder flows where the heat is. So we want to keep the heat at the top so that the solder will then flow up. But at first you want to heat the seam and then focus your heat on the top and let it flow. We're moving the torch all around. I call it keeping the torch alive. So you're moving it back and forth so that the silver doesn't melt. So I'm going to start my torch. I'm going to light my torch. And you see, I have the tip of the blue right there. That's what I want to focus on my seam. So I'm going to start heating up my seam. I'm going to go back and forth. Oh, this torch went out. Go back and forth. I'm slowly heating up the seam, keeping going back and forth from the front to the back. and I'm dragging. I want to focus my heat at the top, and the solder went. And if you saw it go up, it disappeared and it went into that seam. Once it goes into that seam, I want to make sure that the solder went all the way to the top. If it didn't, I can relight my torch and I can just heat that up a little bit so that I know, and I'll see the silver, kind of the solder go a mercury mirror-like color. And once I see it at the top, I know that the solder went up there. After I solder, I'm now going to take my tweezers and dunk it in the water, because I don't want to walk around with a hot piece of metal. After I solder it, I'm going to take and put it in the pickle bath. The pickle bath is used to take off any of the oxidation that was introduced while soldering. And I'll go and put it in the pickle bath. Now the second method to soldering is using the third hand. Third hand, what you're going to do, it's the same step. You're going to take the majority of the same steps. You'll take and you'll swish the ring in boric acid. And I'll take my third hand and I'll clamp it so that the seam is right at the top, and you can see the seam. And I will burn off the alcohol and the boric acid, and you see it go white again. Now this time, I'm going to put the solder right on the top of the seam. So I'll take my flux and I'll just paint flux on the top and bottom. Flux protects the seam and also helps the solder flow. Now I'll get 2 pieces of solder. You want to cover the seam on this about, depending on the size of your solder pieces, 2 pieces should do. So I put 2 pieces of solder right there. Now once again, solder flows where the heat is. So I'm going to start off with heating the top, and then I'm going to come underneath and I'm going to heat the bottom. I'm going to heat on the inside. Because the solder is on the top, I'm going to solder, and when the solder melts, it will flow to where the heat is, which is underneath, and it will pull through the seam. Once again, I'm going to keep my torch alive. I'm going to keep my torch alive, burn off that flux, and I'm moving it back and forth. The hottest part of the torch is the tip of that blue. Okay, I'm heating both of it. I'm going sideways to follow the seam, and now I'm going to come underneath. Heat the bottom, and then go up to the top. And the solder melted right there into a ball, and now it's ready to flow underneath. And you see it flow inside the seam, and you pull it away. I check to make sure it's all the way there, and if I need to, because it's still hot, you can see the solder flowed all right here. I'm now going to dunk it in the water. And I can touch it. And now I can put it in the pickle bath to take off the oxidation.